what I see is with the hyperscalers, and this might be all daisies and roses, but I see that it's enabling every single industry out there to rely more and more on network connectivity as a core function of what they need to do to operate, which makes the entire industry bigger.
Which is where that symbiosis kicks in.
Yep.
Yeah, well, and if you're right, and you're the founder of a telecoms vendor, so I'll defer to your to your greater knowledge and experience on that. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're fresh back from Digital Transformation World, where me and Ian were our usual sensible selves, going to bed at 9 o'clock. Not. So you can probably hear from that laughter that we're lucky enough to have a guest. This is Jennifer. I promise not to butcher your surname. Shall I give it a go? Kyriakakis?
Perfect.
There we go.
So you were worried about it. You did it perfectly.
Well, there we are. But I took the pressure off myself by pre-announcing I was going to screw it up. And you are founder and CMO at Matrix.
Correct.
Which is do you describe it as a BSS software or?
We describe it as monetization software.
Monetization
software. Kind of sits in between BSS and the network.
So it's your fault and no one's making any money out of 5G then?
It's okay. I wish I could take the blame for it. No, it's not our fault. We're trying.
Obviously, I was only joking there. So obviously we will get into monetization, and we'll get into, it's not a coincidence that you're here just after Digital Transformation World, because you were there.
I was there.
At Copenhagen. And so we'll chat about that and your involvement in it and all that sort of thing. The other stuff that we're going to talk about, the overarching, you normally get one buzzword that dominates a given show, and it's definitely generative AI, I think. AI in general, but especially generative AI.
It was one of them.
Or Gen AI for sure.
It was the new one.
Not to be confused with an AI that Jennifer invented.
Gen AI versus Gen AI.
This is with a G, not a J. So, and Ian, you've just been writing about that, and you got some thoughts about that, and we'll get into that.
Yeah.
And then another
scattergun thoughts at the moment.
Well, that's what we do on this.
That's what AI is here for, to take all that scattering thoughts and make some sense out of it.
Yeah. Although I'm definitely never using it to write one of my pieces. That's when I know it's all over for me.
Well, yeah. If you do, don't admit it. That's for sure.
Well, apparently the way to do it, if you're sensible these days, is to use the two. So you use it as a starting point, and then you work on it. But I can't even bring myself to do that. It just makes me seem increasingly redundant.
No, and I think it would kind of mess with your thought flow a little bit if you're suddenly dipping in. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was laughing at the redundant. I was laughing at the redundant thing.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a recurring theme as well. No, we kind of count on our sort of style of delivery, which is obviously a bit more conversational, let's say, or gobshitey, if you were being less kind, as being something that will differentiate us from the bots.
There we go.
Whereas if you're a journalist, I'm not going to name any names, although I'm going to name one journalist in a minute, who just does straight up, this thing happened, then I think you should be a bit more worried about Gen AI, because it probably can do a decent job of
do that, absolutely.
Whipping a press release into journalistic shape. And then we're going to
walk around at a bar late at night getting exclusive comments from executives who've had too much to drink.
There we go. I don't think so. I mean, although, do you know what? Maybe there's a business opportunity there. We'll create something called a pissed bot, something like that just goes around getting mashed with people, and then recording everything they say. Anyway. And then we're going to finish off another story that was breaking that wasn't to do with the show, but we were covering anyway, and we're also chatting to our old mate John Strand, who's from Copenhagen, so we always hang out with him when we're there.
Was he there?
Yeah.
I didn't see him.
He wasn't at the show very much, but he was there for a little bit. Yeah.
So we've got to say thanks. John took me and Ian out for dinner on the first night, even hung around with our flight being delayed. So cheers for that, John. We went to a nice restaurant in Tivoli Gardens, where apparently in the past, not so much now, because do you know about Tivoli?
I mean, I walked past it and through it.
Yeah, so you've seen it. It's like a sort of, I don't know, a Disney World without Mickey Mouse sort of thing. But it's got nice restaurants. It just seems a bit more grown up, and it's got nice restaurants. And apparently, in the past, this restaurant would be a place where parents could put down roots.
Yeah, I think it's
have
quite
a few
historic.
beers and let their kids just lark
play
about.
around in the...
Yeah, which sounds like a great idea.
I think it's quite historic, almost like sort of Victorian era or something.
Yeah. Well, that was when John was doing his tour guide thing.
Yeah.
And he was going that actually Disney came over and had a little chat with whoever invented Tivoli Gardens or sort some inspiration from it,
Really?
which you can see, I think. Anyway, so thanks, John, for that. It's good to see you. And and he was chatting to us about this story. We know, one of his favourite topics is the matter of high risk vendors, and I think he's often, I'm pretty sure, publicly been critical of Germany not doing enough.
He's been very critical of Germany.
Yeah. And so a bit of news came out earlier on this week about Germany maybe sort of ramping up the restrictions on these high risk, i.e. Chinese vendors. So we'll finish off on that. I've got one thing I want to address from my coverage of the show. Before we get into the actual show, there was quite a funny bit where... So my first story I wrote, I generally, when I get to the show, I sit in on the initial keynotes and write them up just to get some kind of sense of setting the agenda. And I wrote this one up, and I was a little bit critical of the keynotes because I just thought, my headline was DTW 2023 epitomises the telecoms industry's struggle to evolve. And my sort of narrative hook was that it started off the head of TM Forum, which runs that show, Nick Willett, standing up on stage and saying this is declaring a code red moment, which he had done previously because you'd written it up.
He declared it a few weeks earlier.
Yeah, so it's still a code red moment.
Well, there was only about 10 journalists in the room at that time. So.
Right, okay. He's going, the code red moment has not gone.
Yeah. It hadn't gone in the last 4 weeks.
It's more a code red phase at this stage than a moment, I think. And he said this is a call to arms to telecoms, and it's not unlike previous proclamations from them, just to sort of try and get the whole industry.
Have like a horn, like
yeah.
The alarm went off.
He's basically saying in a more polite way, "Get your shit together." But then immediately after that, we had these incredibly drawn out and exhaustive PowerPoint presentations, and I just decided to make a link between the loss of narrative momentum there and what can often happen in the industry on the whole, where they'll talk a good game at events like that, and then nothing really substantial happens.
Your microphone's moving around of its own.
I know it is.
It must be some AI thing.
No, it's because I moved it to read my thing, and Pierre just leaned in to move it back again. And anyway, and so that was all fine, and I got a bit of feedback that a few people at TM Forum were a bit bent out of shape about it, which is just fine. I mean, it's not in our job description to please the people we write about, is it? You could argue quite the contrary. It's a job of journalists to hold people to account.
Yeah.
But anyway, and so that was that, and that's fine. I quite enjoyed it. Normally, Ian's the one who upsets people, so I feel like I'm sort of catching up a little bit there. But then one particular person took exception to it and decided to go on the record and comment. I'm going to move it again. Sorry, Pierre. Decided to comment on the bottom of my story. So this is a chap called Tony Poulos, who describes himself as a journalist, but I've never known him do anything journalistic. He's only ever been a sort of hired gun for the TM Forum that I've known. But I'm sure you do loads of other cool stuff, Tony. One of which is writing remarkably intemperate comments on people's stories. So I'm just going to, if it's all right, I'm just going to read out verbatim what he says. I'm not going to try and do it in his Australian accent either. Partly because I'd be shit at it. He goes, "Wow, did you get out on the wrong side of the bed, Scott?"
You are doing a little bit of an Australian accent.
Yeah, wrong side of the bed, Scott. There's a few typos that I won't flag up. You were so busy picking the eyes out of the opening session that you missed out on talking to the people there, many of whom actually liked what they saw and heard. Your vitriolic attack on what has been a fabulously delivered event smells of it. Maybe your bosses at Informer directed you to bag one of the best events on the calendar. We should stress here that Informer, which owns both Light Reading and Telecoms.com, is primarily an events company, so his inference is that my puppet masters at the top are telling me to slag off.
So like you, yeah.
Well, quite. So I'll get to that. Directed you to bag one of the best events on the calendar and draw attention to their own events, which I don't think I did in that story.
I don't think you did it.
No.
You didn't.
That hardly attracts such a sizable and intelligent audience. Ooh, meow. And many of your publication sponsors at DTW that have been more than happy with the traffic and the lead generation there may be asking why they should bother supporting you in the future. So he's also sort of having a dig at us commercially, or trying to infer that they should.
You could say that about any critical coverage that maybe will upset the advertisers, couldn't you?
Well, quite, and we can't let that we can't let that be a consideration any more than.
Yeah, well, that to me. I mean, there's almost a good way to take the comment, because if you're prepared to be critical when it's not, when you could upset commercial interests, then that shows you kind of independent and
quite
right.
And not doing editorial based on, well, not doing advertorials rather, should I say? But
and so I sort of read this in the morning. He'd written it at night, which may be relevant. I might get back to that. I just said, great to hear from you, Tony. Thank you for sharing your stream of consciousness speculation about my ulterior motives, but I can't help wondering about your own. And that's before I realised that he definitely was on the TM Forum payroll when he wrote it. I also note that you chose not to speak in favour of the opening keynotes, which is obviously the main thing that I wrote that upset people, in your otherwise thoughtful and considered comment. See you next year. And anyway, and then I found a link to his speaker bio on the TM Forum site, confirming that he's an employee. So the initial irony is him accusing me of ulterior motives and of conflicts of interest.
Right.
When he's trolling my story, when he's wearing the hat of the people I'm writing about. So there's some.
Can I just say also, if you're like a member of the industry, you read your article, and okay, the first keynote was a bit slow. Are they going to say like, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to the TM4, whatever it's called, the DTW, I'm not going ever again because the first keynote is slow. Well, yeah, you just said that. That doesn't mean the whole event is. Well,
you read it. You might, if you read my whole thing, you might decide it was a bit more provocative than how I've characterised it. But I don't think it's that bad.
But I mean, maybe just sort of taking what he said at the start and moving on from Tony. It's like, there seems to be this slight disconnect between some of these events sometimes and what's going on in the wider industry, I think. And
what's the motivation? What you were saying? What's the motivation for people to be there? I mean, again, I don't think the main motivation for people are the keynotes, anyways.
No. Yeah.
So, I mean, you want to.
They would have been delighted with attendance because it was, I think we were talking about this before we came in, 37, 3,800 up from sort of 31, 3,200. Yeah. I mean, my perception has been that I remember going in the Nice days before the pandemic and they'd gone down to numbers that were quite low
1,500 maybe,
yeah,
right?
they'd gone down below 2,000, I remember being told. And there was all this concern about the TM Forum not being that relevant anymore. And to give some credit to them, they've I think they've addressed that quite well. I think Nick Willits, who's the CEO, whose keynote, I mean that first keynote was sort of dominated really by his Code Red talk, I think. But I think he's done a good job of sort of coming in and addressing some of those concerns about the relevance of the TM Forum.
Yeah.
I think the issue is. Some of the messaging is the same. I guess the problem for them is what is the TM Forum? It's like a OSS BSS standardization thing, which doesn't sound very exciting, and not to be harsh on anybody who's in that space, but as important as it is, sorting out OSS and BSS standardization problems isn't going to rescue the telecom industry. But at the same time, they realise that they have to do all they can to protect the telecom industry and buoy it, because that's where everybody's making their money who's in the telecom industry, obviously. So if the operators aren't growing sales, then ultimately everybody else has got a problem further down the road, which is why people like Ericsson's going into APIs. It's not really because they're interested in making money from APIs. It's because they think if the operators make some money from APIs, they'll spend money on base station equipment. If the operators make some money from new services that come around, they're more likely to spend on BSS OSS systems, right. And the TM Forum will be in better health. So this whole Code Red, why would an OSS BSS standards organisation be flagging this up? Isn't it for somebody else to do? But I kind of see where it comes from.
Well, yeah, because they're trying to help. They're trying to solve problems from the inside out, right? From the technical world out, and that ends up being the disconnect. Though, is there's nobody talking about it from the outside in and drawing those lines down. Why do these things even fit together? This is kind of what we talk about a lot, right? Like, what's the commercial reason? What's the business reason for doing some of this stuff? And how do you make sure that actually you're starting with the why? Why are we doing this? Not what is it and how do you make it work together?
Do you think that's changed a bit with them, though, rather than just saying, we need to figure out, the OD, getting into the specifics?
In a macro timeline, like you were saying from 10 years ago, yes, I think it's changed. I mean, we went the thing that you just went through in terms of, the event and the organization kind of dipping down, I would say 2015, 2016, 2017, we stepped out of it for a few years, as I know of some of our operator customers stepped out of it for a few years too, because it didn't seem to be as relevant to what needed to happen in the industry. And then I think they have done a good job over the past few years of bringing executives back in, focusing on things that are actually going to solve real problems. But again, they're solving problems at a very deep layer. So there's a lot. I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. But in terms of some of the things that they were actually flagging up on the keynote stage, and they always make a big deal of these days. One's ODA. Yeah. And the other one's open APIs.
And we'll get onto ODA. I don't want to interrupt, but because there was an announcement that Matrix specifically made that overlaps on that. So I'll just park it until then. Yeah. I'll just finish off my addressing this. This thing. I got two thoughts about it. Firstly, I just want to formally address the allegation of this sort of vested interest, this bias, and that sort of thing. So when we have a guest, we have a little chat before recording the pod, and we were just sat out there, and I was explaining to Jennifer that I just spoke to my boss and told him about that comment, and my boss just laughed. At the very thought of me writing what he tells me to write. And honestly, absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. And I'm pretty sure I speak for you too as well, Ian, that what we write is almost 100% what we feel like writing. There's incredibly light, if any, editorial oversight. Obviously, if we were to write something that got Informa in legal trouble, that'd be an issue. But in 9 years, I never have.
I nearly have.
You nearly have. Yeah, well, you like to walk that fine line.
But you're here today.
And
some lawyers got involved and then it blew over.
What thing we would never do and never be asked to do, and if we were asked to do, would say no, is write editorial that was designed to either promote Informa events or to denigrate competitive Informa, because that's just not journalism and that's not what we do. So that's just to address that. And then I think Tony's comment was so reckless and unprofessional that I think he must have been pissed when he wrote it. That's why I was coming back.
What time is it?
11:13 p.m.
Well, it's unlikely otherwise, isn't it? At the TM Forum at that time of
night. Well, I don't know. I don't know if midnight over there.
Yeah, I was gonna say it'd be an hour later over there then, right?
So it's 12. So okay, he's either a monk or he's pissed.
That's true. Yeah. So he's got mashed. Someone's told him about the story. And he's gone, fuck it, I'm going to have a word. And, it's just not very wise, Tony. Not in the public domain. By all means, send me an email and go, Scott, you're full of shit. But to actually do it in a public environment like that, I think's very careless.
Has anybody reacted to that comment? Oh.
No one else has. But a few people have behind the scenes to me. And I would just say, especially, if I was inclined in a different way, I could point out that, those are actual allegations of sort of corruption. So you shouldn't make those lightly. I'm not. But I just wonder what the TM Forum thinks of it, because either they put him up to it, which is just silly. And if you have got an issue with me, you should fight your own fights and approach me directly, not send your little hired attack dogs to do it on our comments. Or, which I think is more likely, he freelanced it. At which point, I wonder what the TM Forum thinks about someone who is on their site as a speaker bio, as industry insights advisor for the TM Forum, getting involved in such silly stuff. So food for thought there, TM Forum.
You know how they say when you were younger, when you were in, university or whatever, and they would say never drink and dial. Never drink and didn't pick up that phone because that's all you could do back then.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? Like leave the laptop closed, leave the
I think it's almost
smartphone
worse
closed.
in this kind of environment, though, like comments on sites and tweets and text messaging, because phoning someone up when they actually get on the phone, you might think, whereas you just go for the text.
Yeah.
It's just funny. I actually the other night I was just bored on the train on the way home, and I'd had a few, and I started getting involved in Twitter, which is breaking an absolutely golden rule of
You
life.
got involved with what? What's it called?
X. Actually, just
You were Xing, weren't
yeah,
you?
I did.
Xing.
I was Xing. I know that's just not very user friendly, is it? That sounds like you're sending someone a text kiss, doesn't it? And then the next day I remembered that I did it, and just looked back over. I was thinking, shit. And I don't think I did anything too rash, but yeah, you just shouldn't. Don't do anything that leaves a permanent imprint on anything when you're pissed, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's that. I've dealt with that.
Are they thinking of going back to Nice by any chance?
Well, they've
No, because
haven't
the
heard
Acropolis
that.
has been destroyed.
Oh,
they're knocking
that's
down
that,
the
yeah.
Acropolis.
Wow,
Someone's
okay.
knocked down the Acropolis, which
I
is
didn't
a
realize that.
shocking thing to have happened.
They are moving it. They're staying in Copenhagen at least one more year. I think I might have heard some rumour that might change, but they're staying at least one more year.
But-
And you what?
The rumour is that it might be going to Amsterdam. I suspect
Interesting.
my bet is that they'll just renew the deal with Copenhagen.
Yeah.
I think Copenhagen is a really cool city.
Because I would have thought the city of
Strandy will be going,
Copenhagen
yes,
would
it
have
is.
seen 3,700
Right.
people coming in, even more than last year, spending money in restaurants and bars. And
They would have
you know
fought to
these
keep it.
things work. They'll give them a good deal.
Yeah, and it's, 3,700 isn't huge, but it's fairly big. And it's so big. Do you remember the first morning we got in a cab and we said, take us to the Bella Centre where it is. And we weren't sure. The Bella Centre's big enough that you want to get the right entrance.
Right.
And the bloke was like, yeah, I know which entrance. I've already been taking people there. And this was like at about 7:30 in the morning,
Yeah,
wasn't
well,
it?
there's one example of extra business for people in
Well,
Copenhagen.
Yeah.
quite. So no, I mean, I hope they do keep it there. I've really grown to like Copenhagen, and actually, I'll give another positive one in case people think I'm just having a go at TM Forum, because I'm not. And I just wrote a piece today that was largely positive. And one thing I called out at the end was the catering.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the ham was great.
Yeah, the ham was
I
good.
have to agree with you. The food,
Great ham.
food was quite impressive.
The Danish leek sauce thing, like it's really good.
Yeah.
Danish ham.
So that there was good. It was good buffet for everyone, all free at the point of consumption, and there was plenty of nice free booze put on at the end of each day, and then on the final night, Wednesday night, when Ian and I stayed out far too late. Thanks a lot, CC Group. They just opened up about 3 or 4 bars around a really nice little square in central Copenhagen, and it was just a free bar until about 10:30.
It was free?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And I just thought it was really cool. And in some of my piece I wrote today, I was sort of contrasting it with MWC, more on the lines of like the usefulness of the conversations and all that sort of thing. But it, as an experience from like the food and drink and socialising, I thought it was pretty good. So credit where it's due. So why don't we get back? I just sort of
Actually, before we start going, can I do the city of the month? 'Cause
Please do.
We're not doing next week, so
yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce that city.
Well,
But it's a Swedish city, so the Danish cousin.
go on, give it a go.
Upheirad? Yeah.
Wow.
Upphærad.
In India.
No, it's in Sweden.
In Sweden.
Oh, okay.
Upphærad, and then it's Santa Rosa, and then Eastbourne, England.
Where's Santa Rosa?
I want to say California.
Yeah.
Probably. It's sort of fairly generic Spanish name that could be all sorts of places. Like there's probably about 400 Santiagos in the world.
What's the connection?
This is people who've most listened to the podcast.
Ah.
City in
got it,
California.
okay.
Yeah, it is California.
All right. So we've got Sweden, California, and what was the
Based in
third one?
Santa Rosa.
England. Eastbourne.
That's
Eastbourne.
I don't know.
That's retired
That's kind
people
of
listening to the
strange.
pod.
Yeah, it's a strange one.
I think it's like Cupertino.
Santa Rosa is north of
Right, exactly. Or Santa Clara or something like that.
Santa Rosa is north of San Francisco. Like a 30-minute drive.
Where?
Oh, so it's up in okay,
Oh, so
up
it's
near Marin
going up
somewhere.
towards Napa Valley.
Yeah.
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 Again, not making a lot. I don't know.
Did we talk about wine a lot?
No, you guys talk about beer, don't you?
Oh, look, I've just seen in my emails. I asked John Strand to send me some commentary, but he's about a day late because I've already written my thing. But this is one bit. He goes, "I hope you enjoyed Copenhagen and the charm that I feel the city provides." And I did.
It is
It's charming.
I did, and I think it is charming. But sorry, John, you were too late to make the story.
He's such a patriot.
Yeah, he is. No, he loves it. He's like hanging out with a tour guide. So yes, let's get back, Jennifer. Now I've finished settling scores. Why don't you start by telling us what you were doing at the show and what Matrix was talking about at the show? Yeah.
So we, again, I mean, we're there. This is like the show that focuses really on the niche that we do, right? So, I mean, we go to Mobile World Congress, but like you said, like sometimes those are, you're meeting with people there who aren't necessarily, know what you do or are looking for a solution in your area. There, at least, everyone is somewhat savvy on what vendors like us do, and they're looking for solutions and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, we're mostly there. We do catalysts, so we're there to kind of look at the catalyst projects and showcase those, and then we're there to, meet with customers and prospects and partners, just to further engagements, further conversations, et cetera, et cetera. But we did make an announcement. So we did announce. We did not make an announcement about AI.
On which more later.
We'll talk more about that later. No, I mean on a little bit more the practical side of things. We announced a digital monetization solution. So it comes back to the whole ODA thing that you were talking about, because the way that we see, like we look at the last 10 years of digital transformation as very much kind of focused on the engagement layers, omni-channel, chatbots, how do you find customers? How do you increase your how do you turn them into customers? How do you onboard them faster, smoother? And I do think a lot of that, there's been a lot of huge changes there that have helped a lot. When we look at sort of the other side, the billing and the revenue management, and essentially what you actually do to make money. Like, how are you going to figure out how to make money?
Yep.
Fairly fundamental.
Fundamental. Doesn't get enough attention. There's lots of confusion even around the word monetization and what does that mean.
Good point.
And so we should talk about that. But the thing is like when you talk to people about, okay, well, what are you doing on that side of the house when it comes to systems and processes? Most people are still just trying to do consolidation projects, right? They're still like, oh, we have 20 or 30 different systems and we're just trying to get down to one. Or one or two. Yep. And that's not fundamentally changing the way that business is done. So, what we announced in the solution that we announced, it does align with the ODA, but that's around figuring out how do you actually revamp and re-architect all of these things that make up this messy space of revenue management and billing. How can you actually re-architect it? Figure out which components are actually necessary, which components are unnecessary, and then how they should be redesigned to actually be able to make money off of these services. So that's a lot of what we were there to talk about. I mean, we've always pitched something a little bit different. We built our product very differently than what was supposed to be standard in the industry anyways at the time. So it's still that continuation of, hey, you should be doing this differently. This is how we think you should be doing it. And, in some cases that gets met with, yes, we help, we need to figure this out. We need to do something differently. And sometimes it gets met with, but this is the way that we've always done it. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Why would we look at that? So
I mean, just in terms of you doing it differently, how can you sort of go into the specifics there? And has ODA been kind of a help?
ODA has been a help, and I think this is part of it's that bigger theme around. And Scott, you and I touched on this earlier. There's things that get developed outside of the telco industry that we're really good at bringing in and using like very effectively. And I think AI falls into that. I think cloud native falls into that, right? So a lot of this is about sort of that ongoing evolution of cloud native. And, people have been building all of these applications in the BSS side for years and years and years and decades, right? And every time you needed something, you built something, or you took a framework and you had a vendor build it, or whatever. And when it comes to cloud native, that's actually about taking making things that are components that are reusable, that are reusable across a multi-vendor environment, that are reusable across infrastructure, that are reusable across your business though too. And so you think about if I have a function, or a service that says I'm going to, figure out, I'm going to charge this service based on consumption. That should be usable no matter what you're consuming, right? That function should be reusable, and that function should happen as the thing is being consumed. And so it's a matter of simplifying a lot of this down and going, why do you need 8 different systems? One for wholesale, one for retail, one for, we want to offer subscription type services, another one because we want to do consumption type services. These are all just microservices that should exist in a unified way that, can be reused and extended across your business. Then you're simplifying all of that down into a single path. So as things come from applications, as things comes off of devices, as things comes off the network, there's a much more streamlined, simplified path to go, okay, Mr. Customer, here's, how we're going to charge you for this, and here's how this is what you owe, and you can pay it any way you want to pay it. And, you can dial up, you can dial down, it's that whole dynamic consumption of stuff.
Just one quick thing I want to say. I was having one conversation while I was there, and this sort of thing you were just describing came up, and I said, one use case that always springs to mind for me is like micropayments enabled by telcos as opposed to what we used to call OTTs, hyperscalers, big tech, whatever. And, one I think of is journalistic, is like, I don't want to subscribe to the New York Times or the Telegraph, but sometimes I want to read one of their stories. Could it be set up so it's just a one touch, okay, you can read the story, but it'll cost you £1?
Yeah.
I go, yeah, all right, then it's worth it. And that sort of micropayment, very sort of one-touch sort of thing doesn't seem to exist.
I'm going to call it something different, from the consumer. It's an impulse buy.
Yeah, and anyway, this one chap who works for a big telco, but I won't name him just because it's not necessary. We just said, well, there are regulatory constraints to operators doing that. I believe him. He's quite senior at a major operator, so that's an interesting thing as well. It's not just technological. There are some sort of regulatory impediments to this more agile type of stuff. In
some places, not in all places. I mean, if you look at the way that there's a number of operators who have launched. Who've gone this way to this model, or they've launched a digital brand that's doing that model, right? So there are some places where it's regulated, but I think in most places there's...
Maybe he was overstating.
Yeah, I think
that's why I didn't want to name him. I'm not even sure I fully interpreted what he said. Anyway, sorry, mate, I interrupted you.
But I mean, that doesn't happen very often, does it, in telco?
What doesn't happen?
Micropayments.
No, and I'm saying it should.
Right, but... I mean, even where I just don't see any examples of it. I mean, it sounds like the app kind of. My son's does games on his iPhone, for instance, and every now and again, it's like, "Can I buy this game for 99p?"
Right.
And literally, he puts his fingerprint on the device, and I get a thing saying you've just been charged 99p. It's immediately off the account. He's got the game downloaded. That sounds like what we're kind of talking about. But is that something that your kind of software would enable a telco to do more easily?
Yeah, absolutely. But don't think of it in those terms, and because there are places in the world, like in Asia, where that does happen, or where there's more of an ecosystem where the operator is charging for that stuff, and so they are doing that. Not so much here, but think about it more akin to on the way that people buy cloud services and cloud infrastructure, right? I need more today than I did yesterday. Yeah. I need less, I need to spin it up. I need to spin it down. It's more of that, like, okay, I'm going, let me use what I need when I need it and not when I don't. And the telecom model has always been to over provision everything.
Yeah.
So
you're talking more as a service type of concept.
Well, you could call it as a service, but it's more.
You could call it AS.
You could call it AS. You could just call it dynamic, right? I mean, again, you're not selling somebody a static thing, and that thing is basically it's the max of what they might ever consume.
So even to the extent of so the smartphone plans that we all buy in the UK, and I don't know how it works everywhere around the world, but certainly Europe's pretty similar. I pay a ridiculous amount for my phone actually, but
you don't pay it.
Do you?
But I don't pay it. But it's crazy, and with that I get basically everything's unlimited. And then, my youngest son, who's 13, I've got him on a plan. I'm actually moving him up to a plan where he gets 10 gig a month, I think, because it's not very expensive. And then he gets unlimited texts. But ideally what I'd like to do is go, well, there are days when, he's going to be out on the bus. I know he's going to see some friends. He'll want to watch YouTube on the way. That's a day when he's going to be using data. And then for the rest of the month, he probably won't use it at all because he'll be at home on Wi-Fi.
On Wi-Fi, yeah.
Is that the kind of thing that you could enable more easily with what you do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that implies a completely different charging model.
It is a
for the
completely
operators.
different. That's what I'm saying. It's a completely different. Commercially, it's a different model, but to get then this is back to the TM forum and the relevancy, right? But behind the scenes, underneath it, is also a completely different architecture from a system standpoint in terms of how things are fit together and how they get processed.
Right.
Because it is moving everything. Whatever you're monetizing, it does have something to do with the network. It doesn't mean you have to, necessarily be charging by bits and bytes, but whatever you're monetizing, even if you're in a marketplace, has to do with network consumption. So the functions that actually monetize that stuff should be sitting there right there with the network. They shouldn't be, in some system that gets it 5 days later and might remember to put it on the bill or not put it on the bill.
So it's tying these different parts together, basically, in a more coherent way, rather than having one system for... This omnichannel is an interesting word, isn't it? Because it sounds like there's been one system for... And I'm sure this happens actually in all areas. You go into an EE shop and you try and sort something out, and then a day later you get an email from the bit that does the e-commerce side of things.
Right.
They don't seem to have been aware what's going on. And
my favorite is
omnichannel is great for the end consumer, but it needs to be relying on the same data underneath, right? So that's part of the issue. Is the data and the functions that serve those different channels need to be consistent.
Okay.
I joked at the start and said it's your fault that no one's making any money out of 5G. The more serious angle on that is just the 5G monetization, which is obviously a big thing. It was, I thought, the predominant theme going into Mobile Congress this year, i.e. the lack of it, or the apparent lack of it. Here we are 3 or 4 years into the 5G cycle.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And I'm just curious. I hate to use really cliched, unsatisfactory terms like killer app, but
there's no killer app.
Well, quite. So we accept there's no killer app, but killer app does serve as a sort of North Star of what use cases are sort of heading in that really essentially important direction.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the fact that we're 3 to 4 years into the 5G cycle. I mean, the pandemic did slow things down, right? So we were in a number of cycles. There was a number of operators who stated publicly even that they were going to have 5G SA, which is standalone, which is the core.
Yeah.
Rolled out at least in part by the end of 2021. All of that got pushed out, right? So we're I would say running 2 to 3 years behind where operators thought they were going to be anyways in terms of rolling core. Now, I see the killer app for 5G is kind of what we just talked about. It's dynamic selling. Like that's the ultimate commercial goal is dynamic selling to customers, and it doesn't have to be you or me, to a business, to whatever, to a customer when they need it, what they need when they need it, very tailored to what they need. It's dynamic selling is the killer app. That could be in anything. That could be to an end consumer that, 2 years from now when we actually have, VR and AR headsets that are more manageable. It could be for that experience. It could be for an enterprise that has 5 manufacturing lines going today instead of 2, right, or whatever it is. So, but it's to me, dynamic selling and across any industry, across any line of business, is the killer app,
right.
And you can't get there until you have SA.
So, as you were saying earlier, it's switching away from you have a £60 a month contract and you get this block amount of stuff. To this much more fluid, scalable adaptables.
Yeah, and probably not so much in the consumer market until there's more devices. Yeah. The cell phone, the smartphone, I don't think anything that happens on the smartphone, I don't think is going to change that. I don't think that model is going to change until we have other devices than the smartphones that we're using that will drive that demand, but more on the enterprise and small, medium business side. I think that's where you'll see the dynamic selling start to pick up, and that is where they can drive more revenue.
There was one I was chatting to Ian about that resulted from a conversation I had at the show where someone spoke about drones as a service.
Yeah.
And
we're both excited about that.
We were,
because I can actually seriously see that as a potential growth.
And there, the sort of scalability you talk about. You're someone who delivers. It could be as big as Amazon or a courier or whatever. and presumably, while there's some predictability in the volume of stuff, there's also a fair bit of oscillation. And drones as a service could be something that operators can do. And suddenly you've got these clouds of these little nutters flying around with their
and there's also packages. Drone detection service, which is equally as important.
Right. so that was one that came up. But then, you're right on the consumer side. I mean, my view, like this year at Mobile Congress, I think Ericsson and Vodafone were demoing something that you were describing where you can one-touch pay for better connectivity for online gaming.
Yeah.
Which I thought I could see that as some kind of illustrator, but I couldn't see that there being much demand for it myself.
We've been pitching that use case for 15 years, right? And different variations.
Yeah, it was feeling a bit tired.
But I think, I think it's actually getting the connectivity, actually getting all the pieces in place to actually get there. A lot of that has to do also, again, with a shifting business model, which I think is good. I mean, because if you dig underneath some of those types of use cases, it's not about necessarily even the operator making money off of the end customer. That end customer is actually paying the gaming company to get that boost. And the gaming company is paying the operator and the cloud provider to provision more resources at the edge to support that. And so that's what I'm saying. The business models around that are changing, and we're enabling some of that stuff. And so I think it's digging into understanding maybe the flows of money and where the money, who's going to really make money off of what. Yeah. That is different than what we were pitching 15 years ago when we were just push the button and you get a speed boost and now you're going to have super fat. But they couldn't guarantee that anyway.
15 years ago. Come up with a new thing for your stand.
So this gets into the network APIs thing, doesn't it? I suppose, which I've always been a bit sceptical about, but because APIs have been talked about for so long. But I mean, I know there was this announcement Deutsche Telekom and Ericsson did this week, where they have these 3 APIs that are being sold through a Deutsche Telekom new marketplace that you can, but it's powered by Von Aegir, obviously. I thought it was a bit curious because it didn't seem like what was originally promised when Ericsson came in, where they sort of positioned Von Aegir as a kind of commercial intermediary between telcos and and the kind of developer community, because even if Deutsche Telekom sticks to these Camara standards and therefore people are working off the same kind of recipe, any bank that wants to kind of leverage those apps, presumably it's still only Deutsche Telekom's mobile network, and you'd have to have Telefonica and Vodafone also doing the same thing for it to be really worthwhile. One of them was called device status, so you can basically check on a customer's whereabouts. And it helps with credit card fraud, which sounds great, but it needs to be a cross-industry thing for it to be useful to me.
It does. I'll step back, and to me, there's the bigger story on that, though, is the fact that the operators are now finally even willing to do this, right? I mean, you got to remember how the networks have always been completely locked down. I mean, the fact that this is they're accepting this and moving in this direction and opening up with APIs, I think that's the fundamental big shift that's happening, the positive shift. And I would say that, part of the reason that like I was saying, we bring things in from other industries really well, and then we create this cool stuff, these networks, and then other people, but we don't tend to make much money off of it. Everybody else does, right? Yeah. So that sort of loss of the ability to monetize the value chain is what happened with 4G. So with 5G, this whole concept of network API, and that's the way to make sure you don't lose your piece in the value chain. Right. So I think they finally figured that out. A lot of this work is about making sure that they do have those in place to monetize. But that's why you have that's why you have so many standards bodies trying to drive stuff, is because there is the concept of, there is more and more the concept of building kind of, network sharing and kind of ways to make global connectivity possible. Yeah. And I think those will keep advancing too. So, I think there's, like I said, there's a long way to go with a lot of this API stuff, but I feel like it's moving in the right direction.
Do you think anybody's going to make any serious money from it though? Because I think the Ericsson statement on the DT deal was, well, here's what the APIs market is going to be worth in 2028. And it was based on a forecast by STL, but they were obviously using that, and it was 20 billion. And you think, well, that sounds very nice if it goes to a couple of API type companies, but if it's shared among a telecom industry that makes more than $1 trillion annually, I mean, Ericsson was saying, but there will be higher value opportunities from related services. And I noticed he was saying, which I didn't really consider before, but I guess if you have to provision more at the edge or do something and a developer's willing to pay for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I don't know. I think looking at it that way too is a strange way to look at it quantitatively in terms of how much money you're making off the APIs. I mean, how much does it add across the industry? You know, because what are you generating off the services? What are you generating off the infrastructure? What are you generating off the data? Right? I think you got to look at those three pieces of it. Like there's service revenue, there's now infrastructure revenue because there is this dynamic provisioning of edge resources and there will be slices and things like that. So you make money off the infrastructure and you make money off the data that those things are generating and being able to use that data to drive further monetization. So you're looking at all three of those buckets before you really know.
Okay.
And a lot what you were talking about reminds me of some other talk that goes on to do with cultural shift. I think some of this comes into the telco to techco cliche. But I do find the cultural stuff interesting. Because, especially for telcos, because they're stuck between being a utility and being a technology company. And you get the impression that their legacy mindset is a bit utility-ish in so much as they want people to just sign up for long-term recurring contracts and then just get what they're given, like we would with a water supplier or whatever. And yet, you know, everyone knows that there's a massive imperative on them to be more agile and all these other buzzwords that get chucked about. And so culturally, I wouldn't know where to start. But how do you change the culture of a 10,000, tens of thousands headcount operation?
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah. Well, and I've seen so many cycles of it go by too, right? And I think in the last wave, there's this tendency to say, well, we're going to bring somebody in at the top who's from a different industry, who has a different perspective, but you can't just bring somebody indifferent at the top, right? You literally have to...
They can't just shout change.
You can't just shout change, right? And a lot of times they might be missing the nuances, of the industry as well, right? And not sort of... You can't necessarily pick up concepts from one and put it in another and expect them to work.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of reskilling, right? It's some of the larger operators, they're lucky in that way, right? There's operators that do put a lot of investment into reskilling. And, we've seen from the inside, if you bring in, a lot of times if you bring in a CIO, I won't say CIO, CTO, I won't say from a different industry altogether, but who has a more diverse background, right? With, yes, maybe some telco, but also software and other industries, who really can change the organization a little bit at a time. But you have to bring people along with you. It's in the same way that we've been talking about digital transformation for 10 years, the cultural component of that will continue to go. I think the real issue though, is if the commercial teams don't, drive change and drive some interesting things that the telcos are doing, it's going to be hard to attract.
Yeah.
Right.
Are you, the going back to the Code Red thing, and I think Nick also said on stage, we've got 3 years to do something. Otherwise, it's almost implying it's too late. Scott and I were both looking at each other saying, what happens in 3 years? Does a bomb go off or something?
Just let me quickly, because I got, in the one I wrote, I got some comments from Andy Tiller, who we've known for years, and is their, what's his job title? EVP of Products and Services. And what did he say? He says, we believe our industry has 3 years to get fit for growth, to simplify, modernise and automate our networks and businesses. I mean, that's quite a lot to fit into 3 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's a further qualification of what that 3-year thing is.
Automating and digitising and doing NFV and doing other things for 10 years now, I think.
That was really the tone.
This is why I'm always a bit worried, because this cycle's been going on now for quite a long time, since the noughties, really, I think, is when things started to go.
Yeah, and this is back to
99, 2000. I remember when I came into telecom, everybody's like, oh my God, look at how much money the telcos can make, and their stock market valuation. I think Telefonica was,
along with everyone else, it must be said,
on stage.
Yeah.
Well, no, but more so. They
Even
were,
more them.
They were the
Yeah.
high-value companies at the time, I think.
I think it was the
energy.
advent of the OTT was the start of the slide.
That
The over
was
the over the top.
Yeah.
But I just worry that we're going to be sitting in Amsterdam in 2026 with Nick going, we've got 5 years to...
Yeah. Well, and that was
Okay, but again, this goes back to like the bringing something like cloud native that was not, designed from the inside out from telco, bringing that in and applying it to telco is actually, where I see bigger strides have been made. Bigger strides have been made in moving to cloud native over the past 3 years than were made with NFV and however long people were chasing that, right? 7 or 8 years.
Can I ask just because I think before we came in, I was trying to ask a couple of specific questions and I just forgot about. Now I've remembered one of them.
okay, cool.
But this business of how you because the BSS market is quite big and fragmented. There are a couple of big vendors involved. There's lots of smaller players. I know a few years ago, I talked to Ericsson at the show actually. He got into big trouble a few years ago with one of their products called Revenue Manager, which is like a full stack BSS offering, and they've tried to move away from that and towards being able to. Essentially, if someone just wants to take a few of their things but have others slotting alongside them, they say they can do that now. But I'm kind of interested from your perspective, if you were to be picked but somebody wants to stick with an Amdocs or a Netcracker for other elements, is it quite easy to kind of slot in alongside those
and I
guys,
think
or,
that has to do with when we came to market, when we were concepting the company and looking at the architecture and building out the technology, we knew that we had to fit into a multi-vendor environment, right? So we came at it with composability. We came at it with we're going to have to coexist. We're going to have to go in. We're going to have to connect into product catalogs. We're going to have to connect into CRM systems. We're going to have to connect into existing billing systems. So we already knew that, and that drove a lot of our design from the beginning. But so many, and again, it's the consequence of being 30, 40-year-old companies with 40-year-old solutions, right? You have. Some of them have dropped what they had and started over on certain pieces.
Yep.
Right? Because they had to. And unfortunately, that's the only way that they could get to the state that they need to get to. But yeah, it's easier for us to do that. It's easier for us to go in and go adjunct to what's already there. And the good thing about it is actually focus on growth and focus on services, right? So it's not necessarily just a cost efficiency consolidation, which is a lot of what you hear on the billing side play. It's like, how do we put something in that's actually going to drive new revenues at the same time that it's simplifying the architecture?
I would almost have thought it'd be harder for them in a way, because if, like you say, that some of them are 30, 40 years old, they've got systems that were never obviously designed to be cloud native,
right.
And it's you might be able to kind of operate in that world where you can, but unless they've adapted, then they have a bigger problem with this.
That's why you see them. That's why you see, they're pitching certain things when you come to these shows, right? Like they'll pitch their SaaS solution, or their newest, real-time SaaS solution, which has really nothing to do with the big monolithic thing that most of their customers are still running.
Right. Okay. And in terms of the, one of the other themes that we're probably not going to talk about much. Well, we are actually probably the Gen AI side.
Well, I was about to. I mean, if that's where you're going, I was going to try and move it in that direction anyway.
This might be a segue anyway, but the public clouds and software being hosted from the public clouds. I mean, interesting getting your perspective. There seems to be all this talk, and certainly with BSS, that seems to be a bit that there's more willingness perhaps on the part of telcos to run that from a public cloud as opposed to putting core network infrastructure in there. Is that happening, and are you moving a lot that way?
Yeah. So I would say that again, Matrix is a bit of in a unique position because we straddle both, right? So we have a network function at the core of what we do, but then we also do a lot of monetization pieces that you would consider our classic in a BSS application or in an IT application. So when it comes to our stuff, we are seeing public cloud adoption now, which again, it's in some places we're kind of like the test bed on that, right? We're the first network function they're actually moving into public cloud.
Yeah.
But I would say, I think it's somewhere around 40% of our deployments are public cloud now.
Okay, that's quite high compared to other vendors I've spoken to who didn't want the numbers cited, but probably because they're low. But
well, here's a segue to what I think your current angle is on Gen AI. In the past, Ian and I, we've certainly spoken about it loads on the pod. I mean, and this goes all the way, we were speaking about it for years, it goes all the way back to when we had Danielle Royston on, who's this unapologetic public cloud cheerleader. And she came on knowing that we'd been a bit skeptical, not that people like AWS and Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure don't do a lot and don't bring a lot to the table.
Right.
But just primarily, well, only speaking for myself, worrying about putting all your eggs in one basket, over-reliance on any third party.
Right.
And the lack of redundancy as well. If you go to pure public cloud and you don't have anything on premise, it feels that you're quite exposed. Anyway, so that's an angle we've taken, and we had a good chat about that with Danielle a few years ago. Sorry I didn't bump into you at the show, Danielle. You're overdue another visit.
I did, though.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Well, an hour-long meeting with her.
Okay, well, if you've got anything to reflect on that, then feel free. So you were talking, you said about 40% of your deployments are in the public cloud. So can I assume that you're pretty pro public cloud in the telecoms context then? Yeah,
we're definitely not anti. Again, there's places, it's all operator specific when it comes down to it, right? Yeah. I mean, there's operators that are embracing it. There's operators who aren't. There's operators who can't because there's not enough infrastructure in their country, right? Because, data has to remain in country.
Yeah, interesting point.
So it's not, there's places where they can't go public cloud even if they wanted to. Yeah. I think there's still a very strong, there's very strong for private cloud as well. I mean, that's what I'm saying, for 40-40, right? I would say it's equally private cloud going forward too. I would say there are still some holders on too. There's hangers on that still want to run like literally on bare metal.
Right. Will that be the 20?
That would be the 20, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, it is a learning curve. I would say it's a learning curve for everybody. I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest challenge, is whether or not these infrastructures are all different than what you were running on 4, 5, 6 years ago. So, and every public cloud is different. And every private cloud is different. And so there's just a learning curve across all of these things for both the operators. They don't necessarily have the skill sets. For the vendors too. I mean, these things all act differently. So, it's a bigger investment for the vendors also to be running in these different environments.
From your perspective, do you find it, you talk to people about portability of software the ideal thing, I guess, is to have one set of software that a developer like you would come up with, and it doesn't matter where you want to run it, the same thing can go anywhere, and minimal effort is required in doing that. And you talk to some of the operators and they say, well, it partly depends on the type of function you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I think IT workloads are perceived to be easier than the network
workloads because the latency.
Yeah, but from the sort of stuff that you're involved in doing, if you were, I don't even know if these situations arise, but theoretically it sounds like they could in the future. That if you had a telco using AWS to host some software, and the telco wanted to sort of take it and move it into Azure or Google Cloud, how doable is that? Is it? Yeah,
it's doable, but you don't push a button.
Yeah,
right. I mean, there's work behind it. There's testing behind it. The same software can run in different clouds, but there's there's things that are configuration changes that have to happen, that have to be tested.
Yeah.
And so no one's pushing a button yet.
Yeah. So, if it's all right, I'm going to, just because of time, I'll move on to the Gen AI thing. Yeah. Because I thought that was a bit of a segue anyway. So you're in the middle of writing a piece which may be published by the time we publish this.
Yeah,
sort of Monday lunchtime.
Well, I finished writing it, actually.
Oh, you finished writing it? Okay. And you had...
Unless the editor throws it back at me and says this is all rubbish.
This is shit, start again.
Any sense whatsoever.
Write about something you know about. But Yeah, why don't you give us a gist of that? Because I think it at least overlaps a bit. And
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty broad because I just went around and I thought it's nice to have something thematic at a show. So it doesn't really drill down too heavily into one area. I mean, I've written about AI before in the past with these sort of worries about impact on the workforce or concern about things like hallucinations where, it has to be used in a certain way then.
Do you remember the one we spoke about where the chatbot started being a stalker?
Yeah, totally.
It basically turned into HAL from 2001.
Yeah.
Well,
I've heard some strange things. Yeah.
This is why one of the things I think that's emerged from that is, when you talk to companies about how they're going to use it, and the telcos and actually it was mainly vendors, I think, sort of Gen AI salespeople, I'll call them at the show, very much sort of using the word co-pilot to describe it, which is, I talked to AWS before, not AWS, but an AWS partner called Snowflake, which you'll know of, it's the data cloud company. And I said to the guy I spoke to there, what if what they're basically doing is ingesting network data and then doing the kind of data processing and number crunching on it, and you can derive insights from that might help a network engineer to do his job better. That's the basic model. But the issue is, what if it tells him something that's that's not accurate, or gives him some. And this is why it's the old guardrails. Yeah, well, this is why we don't.
Well, and that's why you still need humans to
totally, and moving it beyond the stage where he's even involved to the AI implementing that, for instance. And his response is, it's a co-pilot. You wouldn't get it to land the plane.
Right.
It's a tool.
Yeah.
But you need it if you have it as a tool, then you're going to be better than somebody who doesn't have it as a tool, but it won't actually replace you.
But it's that concept as a tool. You remember when we were talking about the event that was just here in this building that Omdia did about AI?
Yeah.
And, I learned a lot from that, to just sort of slightly, I've always been to the point of cliche on this pod, being quick to lurch towards dystopian Terminator sort of scenarios. Such that Pierre even once kept a little Terminator sort of audio sting for just such events. And I thought it was good for me. I'll still do it partly just for the humorous purposes, but it's good for me to be reminded that as it is now, people view it primarily as a really powerful productivity tool and perhaps a tool for other stuff, but just a piece of technology, a classic piece of technology that just does stuff better than we used to be able to do in a lot of different ways. And I'm quite happy to look at it that way, while still, retaining the caution about the guardrails, the ethics, the privacy, all that sort of thing. And you're completely right, Jennifer. We need to have humans involved as much as possible, although, as we discovered at the top of this podcast, sometimes humans can go mental as well. So
we're going there again.
Oh yeah, no, that's it.
You got to bring that back around.
Yeah, no, I was quite happy with that callback. That's what comedians do. It's called a callback. But yes, I'm happy to have some of my more dystopian, sort of perhaps hysterical stuff sort of toned down a little bit, and realise it is a very useful tool if used properly, and that's the big if, of course.
Yeah, and I kind of, what we touched on earlier was I would like to see how it helps actually. I mean, this buildup of custom pieces of software everywhere and it's not just telco, right? Any industry that's been around a long time, they just have these huge stacks with, you try to look at the architecture and there's like 1,000 boxes and all these different things that are doing, one-off functions because one piece of the business needed to do this. Like, how do we first look at how to simplify that layer, right? And use Gen AI to, again, back to the automation thing, to automate a lot more what's going on between systems.
Yeah, we were talking
to better
about
help the person.
We were talking about the PowerPoint slide of software architecture with about 100 different rectangles. We've all seen that one, and we're just saying, let's get rid of some goddamn rectangles.
Some of the rectangles first.
The weird thing is, it sounds like that. I mean, I'm one of the first people to sort of raise the question about how it will impact jobs, but it almost sounds like that's a job creating aspect of it, because from what I've been told, actually by Omdia analysts as well, who sister company of ours, Omdia, but the making sense of the data is a starting point for this. When you're fine-tuning some of these large language models that get taken, and then they were never trained initially on much telecom data,
right.
So you bring it in-house, or maybe Amdocs does, and you try and fine-tune it's the process. You have to have as a starting point consistent data to feed in, and you have to sort of make a lot of sense of the information you put in there, and there's a need for people to work on that process and do it. And now you either do it through someone like Amdocs, or you get Accenture to do it maybe, or you hire your own teams of people to do it.
Well, and I'm going to bring this full circle back to the whole 5G monetization thing, right? Because this is like we talk about 5G monetization, and a lot of times if you talk to a commercial person in an operator, they're still looking around to the forum and to their IT people to figure out what it is they're supposed to be selling. Like, how are we going to turn these into services and packages and things that make sense for people? Yeah. Well, think about how empowered you could make a commercial team to really drive into how I'm going to evolve a product from MVP out to a full-fledged product into a specific industry. You know, it absolutely could create more commercial jobs too, in terms of figuring all this stuff out. Yeah. So.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think the other sort of aspect of the piece I wrote is on the clouds, to bring it back to sort of public clouds, because they obviously play a big role in this space. You know, we're obviously constantly told that the actual training of these large language models needs so much processing power that you can only really do it in the kind of facilities that a Google or a Microsoft might own. It's just sort of binding the telcos to the hyperscalers a bit more closely in a way. It's one more thing for them to, you know, that would be a slight concern of mine, I suppose. I think that one of the concerns about the hyperscalers, it's not a recognition that necessarily they're competing against telcos in some areas. It's this kind of role they now have in the value chain that makes them so critical in lots of different areas. And Gen AI just seems to be another kind of facet of that. And again, you talk to people about, if you're using AWS, say, with its SageMaker machine learning platform to support a few large language models, and then you start using those for really critical things like network operations insights, or, you know, maybe some other activities as well, and you wanted to go off that in the future, it's just going to be incredibly difficult to do it. So you increasingly have this kind of tenancy relationship.
Okay, but I would say the last 10 years has shown us that telcos trying to not be big of a part of a larger ecosystem and not have those dependencies hasn't worked so great, has it? Yeah. So, I mean, I think, and this is back to kind of the wanting to have network APIs and the wanting to be more open. It's a consequence of that, and I think eventually it'll sort itself out. I think that the hyperscalers are also going to be very dependent on the telcos. It's a two-way street. Yeah. And I think as long as both maintain their ability to orchestrate and control the piece of the value chain that they deliver best, that it will remain symbiotic. I hate that word.
Yeah, no, but I completely agree. I completely agree. I made that point in a thing I published today, just saying how. And I do get the impression of that. So last year it was noticeable because it had been the first DTW for 3 years. Yeah. And we certainly weren't banging on about hyperscalers in 2019 to much extent. And so it was notable, certainly from a journalistic point of view. As I was saying, we're always groping for these, perhaps sometimes clumsily, for these overarching themes. Right. But, you just have to. You got to write something, and you're kind of try and do your best to encapsulate what's been spoken about, but it's based on a tiny fraction of all the activity that's going on. Yeah. But I think they're certainly talking a good game, and I've heard this not directly from the hyperscalers, because I don't think I spoke to any this year, but I've asked other people that I spoke to about it, and they certainly seem to be making all the right noises about being collaborative, symbiotic, whatever, about all playing nice together. I think that's what I wrote. I said, So with that in mind, TM Forum's decision to so openly embrace the big public cloud players and their vast computing resources at last year's event. This is on the back of AI, because obviously AI is very computationally intensive, isn't it? Their vast computing resource at last year's event feels especially prescient. Concerns about over-reliance on them remain, but their desire, they being the hyperscalers, for a healthy and prosperous telecoms customer base means it should be in their interest to play nice. And I believe that, but I still get concerned. It's just like a power dynamic. When they're holding so many of the cards, it's in their interest to play nice now, but one day it might not be. One day they might strategically think, let's just make operators these incredibly sort of thin client type of model where all they've really got is the customer relationship, and nearly everything behind the scenes and nearly all of the value extracted behind the scenes is us. So I think it's
that's
still...
where it's going.
Yeah.
You have three big hyperscalers all based in one market. Let's take it to an extreme conclusion where because that's what the worry is, isn't it? It's if we put core network functions there, if we rely on them for Gen AI, a lot of the services that are coming over the network now are the interesting ones come from OTT firms, as they like to be called. Meanwhile, the telecom industry isn't growing. It's the message is automate the hell out of it, as much as possible. It's not hard to see a future where three big companies, underpin last mile networks that don't need very many people and very much look the same, and and the value accrues to the hyperscalers who do all the smart stuff, and they even tell those networks how to work. They even say, at this moment in time, there's a problem in that area, it needs to be fixed, and an AI system will fix it, because by that stage, it's not a co-pilot anymore, it's an autopilot, because we've got past the hallucinations problem, let's say.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing we've got three instead of one, right? I mean, I think that back to that.
It's better than one.
Right.
But it's hard.
But it's not ideal.
And you made the point, sorry, just very quickly, I don't know, I can't remember if it was before or now, you made the point that a lot of people who use public cloud do use a mixture of.
Yeah.
But I still think...
But they use them for different things.
Yeah, the difficulty of switching from one to another. This is something we've been saying for years. The negotiating position that puts you in, when you've got a partner that's very hard to leave, presumably puts you in quite a weak negotiating position. Do you think I'm right to worry about that?
It's systemic risk is what it is.
It's the problem that they had before, though, when you looked at Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei. It's the same problem. It's just
fair enough.
It's moved a bit, right? Now
it is, but the thing I find funny is that, because I mention that all the time whenever anybody goes on about Open RAN, why are you so worried about being reliant on a Nordic duopoly, and you're not that worried about, or you're not apparently as worried about, and they will if you dig down and talk to the CTOs, they say, well, we are concerned as well, hence concern about this portability issue that I'm always harping on about. But the thing about the network side of things is it's actually relatively easy to take out a radio access network and put another one in.
Expensive though.
It's not easy.
Well, it depends at what stage the network's at, because it needs changing out every sort of 7 years anyway.
Right. So if you're it's part of the cycle, yeah.
Deutsche Telekom, I was told on background by someone in the know, had to take out, I reported on this originally anyway, but they went from Nokia to Ericsson for about a third of their network and swapped that out within about 18 months. And they never made any fuss about the cost of it at all.
Well, hold on to that thought, because that's relevant to our final segment as well.
Whereas if you're, the issue that I've got with the public cloud is they're not just doing a bit of hardware that does this, and all right, it's a very important bit of hardware because it's a radio access network. They're doing... they're responsible for parts of automation. They're providing services. They're storing and managing stuff. They're doing AI, which ultimately the idea is that it thinks about how to resolve problems and do things better in the network, and it might not need to be a co-pilot eventually. The only reason this co-pilot word is being used is to. Is partly.
Isn't it actually the name of a?
It is.
I was
going to say it is the name of. It is the name of Microsoft's.
It is. Yeah. It is. But they've obviously called it that to make it out to be sort of a friendly assistant rather than a sinister.
It's basically the evolution of the talking paperclip.
And then people have.
What was that called? I can't remember.
That's called Little Twat.
So it's partly, I think, to address Scott's concern that there'll all be Terminators running around in the future killing us.
Right.
Is use a nice word like co-pilot, and I think it partly just reflects the shortcomings of the technology at the moment. Like, it can't actually replace people because it makes things up and it gets things wrong. And
Clippy, I think it's
Clippy. Thank you. But again, you have to look at the way that telecom infrastructure has grown up, though, it's different, in each country with its own regulation around it. And do you really think that one of the hyperscalers is going to go, we're just going to swallow all this up in every single country?
There will obviously be a cut-off point.
Yeah.
No, I completely concede that. I suppose that what we're really probing, and I'm no expert, is just where that cut-off be and whether there might be a little bit of mission creep over the years that's irresistible. Obviously, there'll never come a point Although, I mean, I think they do. I think some of them does Amazon have an MVNO or something like that? But anyway, we don't expect...
Google does.
Google,
Yeah.
but we don't ever expect them to try and go full operator.
Right.
But it's still possible they could incrementally take more and more of the action. That's all.
But there were reports of Amazon doing an MVNO, I think, that eventually got dismissed.
They were never verified.
But the most interesting thing about it was the day that those reports came out, when they were half taken seriously, I think Deutsche Telekom's share price went down about 10%.
Wow.
And T-Mobile's, the very prospect of one of them setting up an MVNO had that impact on the share price. And I mean, it must have been made out to be a bigger deal than the one that Google does.
Google Fi, right?
That hasn't really sort of gone that far. But because once they do an MVNO, they essentially, and they have all this other stuff that they're already doing on behalf of telco operators. I mean, in the case of Microsoft, they provide core network functions through Affirmed and Metaswitch. So, or could. I don't know how much of that is actually being used, but
again, that's not really targeted. I don't think. My opinion is it's not targeted at mass market, right? I mean, that's mass market consumer. It's targeted at private enterprise, things like that, yeah.
But it's just the role they play in different areas, and then if they come along and do the MVNO, then the only thing they really don't have that's harder for them to get into, and I don't see why they would want to, is the last mile. The last mile.
Right, because everything else is in the cloud at that stage.
But
and the operators don't own the towers anymore anyway.
Right, they've spun those off, right?
Yeah. So where does that leave operators? They could eventually just become service companies. If they sell, the last mile is already at a stage now where there's more talk about network sharing.
Yeah.
And there's talk, I think in Italy, Wind Tre has even gone to the stage of talking about, these tower sharing deals. The towers would also include sort of active network infrastructure and not just because at the moment it's the passive, and you put your own base stations on, but maybe you go to a model where, I think Cellnex has talked about this as well, that the tower, it will also get into the active side of things and not just the passive side of things.
Yeah.
Then the operator is just a service company. And who are the best service companies in the world? Well, they're not telcos. They're Amazon and Netflix and
That's why you see the telcos adopting a lot of these things that the hyperscalers are doing. I mean, I think again, there's not room in the world only for one or the other. I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the practices, the automation, the way that IT systems are being re-architected to more model after what the hyperscalers are doing, is because the telcos at one end of the market, I guess I would say, that's the way that they want to go. I mean, I think you're going to see a bifurcation, like a much larger bifurcation of the market than we have today, right? In terms of those who want to be, full-fledged big service providers, like what they claim a TechCo is, right? In terms of, serving across industries and across solutions. And then I think you'll get ones that are going to focus mostly on being a wholesale pipe. I think you'll get ones that are going to focus on consumer. And see what they can do there. And I think, you've seen that kind of happening a little bit over the past decade. I think you're going to see it even more going forward.
Yeah.
But I don't think that, again, what I see is with the hyperscalers, and this might be all daisies and roses, but I see that it's enabling every single industry out there to rely more and more on network connectivity as a core function of what they need to do to operate, which makes the entire industry bigger.
Which is where that symbiosis kicks in. Yep. Yeah, well, and if you're right, and you're a founder of a telecoms vendor, so I'll defer to your greater knowledge and experience on that. If you're right, then that should be good news. I guess one of the things we have, as journalists who have to write something every day, we're necessarily impatient and short-termist. And we're just like, show me the money.
I'm not saying it will work out in the sort of Armageddon type way that I've said. I'm just saying that there's...
But it's fun.
But I think that to bring it back to Gen AI a bit, it's... There's certainly going to be a balance of power concern, I think, with Gen AI. And I think that's why... I talked to Telus at the show, actually, because they're quite interestingly very keen on getting...
Who did you speak to?
I talked to, I'm going to get his name wrong now, Hashem Fahmy, who's the CIO I don't even know that's how it's pronounced. So
that was
sorry,
good. Yeah.
Hashim, if you did watch, but he's a CIO, and he was like, it's a board level thing. Gen AI, they want to go into it, they want to use it, they want to actually control some of it. So they're they're experimenting with things like stability diffusion and Palm from Google. And what they're doing is that multi-armed bandit thing, when you kind of set people, it's like one of those maths problems where you have a bunch of random things that you set people to work on to figure out what the most effective way of doing it is. But they have data scientists in-house who are taking these different models and working with them to essentially find out which is most appropriate where. And then you're doing a bit of fine-tuning, using your own kind of data rather than... He didn't rule out, obviously, using someone like Amdocs, which has got this Amaze platform that could fit in as well. But they're definitely doing work on their own large language models. And then he was even this business about running them in public cloud facilities, because everybody seems to assume that's always where it's going to happen. And I remember talking to Scott Petty at Vodafone not that long ago, who was like, there's not really a business case for on-premises large language models. But Hashim had quite a different view. He thought that there could be a point when you get past the training phase, and if you're using smaller ones, that they could be put even
Very
onto smartphones
focused.
in the future. Yeah, more focused. So it's maybe you need another word than large language model at that stage, but medium-sized language model.
Niche language.
Niche language model could be
there
done
we go. We just coined a new one.
in edge facilities or smartphones.
Yeah.
Once you've gone past training and you're at the sort of inference stage of it, then there's not necessarily a need to have these huge resources with GPUs everywhere, and it's like too costly for I mean, he said that himself. We wouldn't be able to sort of compete in a market for buying GPUs we can't even get them apparently at the moment. It's like they've kind of
one of the reasons
out.
One of the reasons we all wish we bought Nvidia shares a few years ago.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Just January.
Just since January, yeah.
January, it's gone up like a ridiculous amount this year.
Silly amount, yeah.
No, my wife says that to me. She's like, you're supposed to be in this market. Why don't you tell me to buy Nvidia shares? I'm like, oh, sorry. She's like, you're useless, clearly.
You must be sick of hearing that. Only joking. It's just me being a bastard. Okay, I think if that's all right, I'll move on to the last segment, unless you've got any last thoughts on that. Are you good? Which is that story, which I'll largely defer to you on, Ian, because not only did you write it up, but I remember because I was sat next to you and John were chatting about it a fair bit, and this whole subject matter is John Strand's sort of core area of interest. I know he has others.
Yeah.
But why don't you just start by summarising what is the thing that Germany announced earlier this week?
So it's on the whole high-risk vendors topic, and high-risk vendors really meaning Huawei and ZTE, because
everyone else low risk.
Everyone else is okay. Sure. Yeah, but I mean, there might be other high-risk vendors. I don't know, but it always gets sort of. I think even some governments have actually just come out now and said that's who high-risk vendors are. They used to worry about naming them.
It's always such a po-faced euphemism, isn't it? Maybe they're worried about sounding racist or xenophobic or something.
I don't know. Yeah,
but like you remember when Donald Trump got in trouble for saying the Chinese virus.
I do remember.
That was pretty good.
I'm getting better, Pierre, at my Trump. But yes, it's obviously a euphemism. Everyone knows high risk means Chinese.
Yeah. So they've I mean, some governments have gone really hard on trying to cut them out, basically, and stop you from using them. They're not allowed to be used in the US. You can't, if you're like one of the big four, you can't sort of like
And the restrictions, it must be said, to Chinese vendors have always been higher in the US than elsewhere anyway.
Yeah. I think they were warning about them like way back in sort of 2012 even. There was when Obama was in, there were papers on them, so it wasn't like they ever had a big role there. But then there's been pressure that started off under Trump to, they were perceived as being a security threat potentially. There could be backdoors in the networks that would allow China to spy on other countries or even sort of bring down critical infrastructure.
And the core criticism is that because they're Chinese companies, they're necessarily beholden to the whims of their government.
Well, I think that's the problem for them, is that they're Chinese, really. But
the assumption is that almost uniquely, in China, the the government, i.e. the Communist Party, is able to poke its nose into everything, which may have a fair bit of validity, but I just wonder to what extent.
I'm pretty sure that the UK or the US could tell big companies to do who are involved in critical infrastructure to do certain things a certain way, but we buy into their value system, whereas we don't really buy into the Chinese governments. That's the issue. So
fair enough.
So there's been this. Some countries have already taken a really hard line in Europe. The key one really is our one, the UK, which is banning Huawei from 2028.
Under a bit of pressure from old Trumpy back in the day as well.
So the operators who use it are phasing it out at the moment, and by end of 2027 they can't have any Huawei 5G RAN equipment, and they must have removed it from the core earlier than that. I think it's the end of this year, and the core. So what the German government had done is it had always made this distinction between the core and the RAN.
Which we tried to do. Do you remember?
Yeah, originally that was the...
We had about 6 months of going, all right, I'll tell you what, America, we'll meet you halfway. We won't let them in the core.
Yeah.
And then Trump got on the phone to Boris Johnson and just called him.
Well, they don't say that that's what happened.
No, but that's what I've decided happened.
Well, so
that's the end of it.
Okay, but the UK government's rationale for doing it is that they only did that when sanctions came into force, because then...
You're right. Then there is a more substantial... Although even that's a little bit chicken and egg, because why did the sanctions come in if not to force our hand? But anyway.
Yeah, well, to force lots of people's hands, probably. But... the Germans had sort of resisted going full on with a radio access network ban, and that's where most of the money is in the market. So any company that's providing both would be hurt more by a RAN restriction. The operators, the German operators, were probably quite happy that there wasn't them sort of being lent on in a heavy way, and they've rolled out 5G very quickly using Chinese vendors. I mean, Huawei's got a really big role in Germany. So I'm using John's data here because he's the only person, I think, who's done a really good analysis on levels of Chinese infrastructure in particular markets. He published a really, really good report that was quite widely cited a few years ago on 4G, did a 5G one at the start of this year. And it's about 57-58% of the radio access network equipment in China at the moment comes from Huawei. Right. What's happened this week is, I mean, there's been this steady sort of amount of pressure, I think, coming on the German government to do more. Probably some of it's been coming from America under Biden. Probably some of it's just been coming from German politicians themselves. Or
it could be EU-wide as well.
I mean, the government papers this week that I did manage to get access to some of them. And
German government papers, yeah?
Yeah, what happened was they got, I think, 5 or 6 reporters who do, like Handelsblatt and other German newspapers, got invited to a meeting with government authorities. I wasn't obviously on that list, but I did get some of the stuff afterwards. And they shared these strategy documents with them, which are proposals for like much tougher restrictions on Huawei. And they can be interpreted in different ways. I mean, the thing that seems unequivocal is that they won't be able to use Huawei in the core from the start of 2026. I think it might be sooner than that. I don't know the exact date.
So that's a new thing. So there are currently no legal restrictions on even in the core in Germany.
No, there are, but they
haven't got a time limit on them.
I don't know if there are. there aren't legal restrictions, but there's always been an advice not to use them in the core, which I think stems from some of the EU toolbox stuff. Yeah. So I think the EU toolbox was meant to sort of guide national government policy. And what happened, I think, when that was published was that the operators that were using Huawei in the core started to move away from it anyway. So to my understanding, it won't actually make any difference because they don't use Huawei in the core, any of the big 3. So
the core's not a thing, but the RAN is.
So the RAN is, as I say, it's like 57-58% of the network. And what they've said there is, and this is the bit that's subject to interpretation because of the wording, is that no more than 25% of the RAN can be managed by, software systems provided by Huawei or ZTE by, I think it might be October 2026, which could mean you keep the hardware there, but introduce a kind of a management layer that isn't provided by Huawei and ZTE to run that.
That sort of just dilutes the percentage.
Or it could mean that they want you to take out 75% of the base stations that come from.
And why isn't it 100%? Do you think? Just because that's too harsh.
You'd have to ask them.
It's too hard.
I mean, I don't know why it's acceptable to.
Yeah, is that a move towards 100%? Is it
it could
25%, until and then by
it
2031.
It certainly lowers the cost, obviously, of a swap out and makes it a little bit less onerous.
It's probably presumably been done in negotiation with the operators as well.
Well, I don't think it has been done in negotiation because the report. So I did my report on it, which was before there'd been any operator feedback at all. The one story I did notice as a follow-up to what had happened, which I think Ray LeMaitre, our former boss, who's now at Telecom TV, did yesterday, was the operators are kicking up a big fuss about it. I mean, they're proposals. It's not legislation. They're government proposals. So the idea, presumably, of getting reporters to write about it and was to get the message out that this is what we're looking to do. And then you start the consultation stage and maybe there'll be some kind of compromise. But it's still... They obviously don't want to do it. And because... even if it's more manageable than they'll make it out to be, it's still a cost and it could still be disruptive if you're having to do it in 2 or 3 years' time. So, but the interesting thing
but you just hit on what the question is. Do they not want to do it, or do they just want more time and maybe some help, some aid in doing it? Right? So which is it? Right?
I think they'd rather not do it at all, judging by the UK experience is quite similar. And one of the reasons the UK didn't want to do it was because the thing we've just been talking about for the whole pod, really, competition and optionality. If you take what has been the biggest 5G vendor in the world out of the equation, there's not very many other people who do that in the same way. There's only really two, and they're both in Northern Europe. And then you've got ZTE. Well, you haven't got ZTE. That's not an option, so forget about them. You've got Samsung to a smaller degree, but they've never really had a legacy role. They're very much 4G, 5G. So if you have to support, 3G seems to be going. It's pretty much finished, but 2G might still be in operation for a while. Samsung says it can now support 2G. No one really believes it. You know, it's apart from Vodafone UK. So it's not ideal. I mean, the hope, I think, was that, I think maybe if I'm trying to sort of maybe overthink things, I think that maybe Deutsche Telekom and the German operators thought this was coming at some point, but they hoped by the time it did come, the market might have moved on, because for a few years we've had this support for a concept called Open RAN.
Open RAN,
to try and sort of foment competition by having open interfaces that, you know, you used to sort of have to buy everything from one vendor's system because it wouldn't work otherwise because of these sort of closed interface, semi-closed interfaces between things. If you open it up, you can allow specialists to compete who are only focused maybe on one bit of the value chain, where previously they'd never had a role because they couldn't do an end-to-end thing, so they were just completely shut out by the nature of that. But Open RAN hasn't gone as quickly as people hoped.
Nothing goes quickly. Why do people think these things are going to go that quickly?
Yeah.
Because we're journalists and we're short-termists.
I would still say it's happening, though. I would still say exactly what you're talking about is happening in some places with some operators.
Yeah.
And it's going to take time. I mean...
So I probably over pigeonhole you, but as you know, as sort of monetization software vendor. But I know that you're very experienced in the industry on the whole. The Open RAN, do you think we are being a bit impatient then? Do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what would be, you know, it's probably a bit unfair to ask you, but like a reasonable proportion of a developed markets network to be Open RAN by, I don't know, 2030 or something, because some of the extrapolations you hear, it's still quite low. Yeah. Like 10 or 15% or something like that.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't know I wouldn't know how to sort of project that forward.
I thought it was an unfair question.
Yeah, it's an unfair question. Not one I'm really able to answer.
That's fine.
But I would say that, again, just being involved with a lot of different operators and seeing the things that they're doing. I mean, it's getting work done. It's getting, it's gonna evolve. It's gonna improve. Tell me one thing that the telco industry has announced that has actually hit its peak when people thought it was going to, right? That's hasn't been
just
on
like a hype cycle thing.
It's just a hype cycle thing, right? Yeah. I even remember, when the iPhone launched, you guys probably wouldn't even remember this, that they did not hit their first year targets.
Oh, I remember.
They didn't hit their first year targets, right?
No, and it was rubbish.
And everybody wanted to go, failure, right?
It didn't even have 3G at first.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, that's fine. And so that's one example you could say, but obviously that's one where it was then ridiculously successful afterwards. I think, one that, and I'll invite you to pitch in as well, Ian. one of the concerns isn't just momentum, and that's fine. I mean, it is part of our job to harangue and harass the industry and go, get your shit together. But I just wonder. I mean, my bigger one is just whether or not it's a favourable alternative. I understand it's favourable in terms of vendor plurality.
Right.
I think it's very brave of me to try and say the word plurality when I'm into my fourth beer.
Especially when you got Kyriakakis, right?
Kyriakakis, I can still do that. I'm obviously becoming immune to beer. But just is it any good? Is it even worth it? I mean, it's all very well saying we need to manufacture this vendor plurality because we got rid of the high risk vendors.
Yeah.
But
Well, it would be good if it creates, because nobody really wants a duopoly in any market, I wouldn't think.
yeah, totally.
I mean, it's curious that there's been this focus on the RAN in a way, but then on the other hand, I suppose that's where most of the money goes if you're a mobile operator. So that obviously would be a concern. There are other areas where we can be worried about in the technology sector about concentration of power in certain areas. I think the semiconductor one's a massive one in terms of the manufacturing of it, but they're trying to do something about that with things like the CHIPS Act and other stuff. I mean, how that's going to go, I don't know. It's always difficult, I think, to guide the market, to steer the market. Government's getting overly involved. But I don't know, Open RAN, I think, I mean, my issue, because I track this quite a lot and try and write about it a lot, I just wonder about it working out in the way that we think it will work out. I can see as in a situation, and I already see this kind of happening to a certain extent, where and you actually hear some CTOs saying it as well, where you have it's Open RAN in name. You know, the interfaces have been opened and they're compatible with the O-RAN Alliance stuff, but they're still buying everything from one vendor because, you know, and then it becomes, and interestingly, some of these guys that did start out as specialists, we're going to be software guys. I'm thinking of you, Mavenir, then went into hardware design. They went into systems integration. Rakuten wants to be everything to everybody. There aren't really many that just do one thing that we hear talked about. The big ones that turn up a lot when anybody seems to get a deal are the Japanese and South Korean companies, Samsung. But Samsung does everything. I mean, the Vodafone deployment that's happening in the UK at the moment, which has gone like very, very slowly. And all right, they haven't given targets there. They've just said we're working towards a timeline where we get.
Look, in Rome wasn't built in a day, mate.
2,500 swapped by when is it, the end of 2027 to comply with the government guidelines. But it seems one of the most interesting things there to me was when their original list of vendors came out 2 years ago, the name NEC was on the list as a radio unit supplier. When they did their update a month ago, which Scott and I both reported on, every single vendor that was on there the first time round was named except for NEC. So with implication being that the radio units and the software, which are the kind of two critical things that they wanted to kind of break apart, the baseband and the radios, that was always what Open RAN started out as. Let's have different ones doing those. Will come from the same company. It's it's almost more of a virtual RAN than an Open RAN.
You can look at it that way. I mean, I think, again, with any of these things, what's going to drive, it's just like, what's the market force that's going to drive it, right? And if it is code red and 3 years from now it's still code red, well, does that then create...
That's where my money is.
I like using the code red thing again.
It's going to be code purple in 3 years.
There we go. And then it's code purple. I mean, is that going to drive, you know, the telcos to force the Open RAN even more? I mean, we'll see. I do know operators that are, you know, they have already kind of worked with, kind of gone around the big two players and directly to some of their suppliers for certain pieces. That, again, so this stuff's going on. It just depends on, hey, if the operators figure out how to make a ton of money from 5G, then the Open RAN thing will probably just die. Yeah. Right.
I think one of the.
But sorry, just quickly, button. Is there a commercial element to Open RAN? I mean, does it lower overheads or increase revenues?
No, lower overhead, allegedly. Allegedly.
It might lower costs if you have more competition in the market.
Oh, just from a pure heightened competition point of view, right? There's nothing intrinsic in the technology, it's just that there's more players, and therefore that drive prices
down. If by Open RAN you mean virtual RAN, cloud RAN as well, and they're slightly different, but they kind of get
God knows we've been
conflated.
over that a few times.
Then there are arguments that the technologies themselves will bring lower costs.
Okay, fine. Sorry, you were about to say something. I just wanted to clarify.
I was going to say, I think one of the main reasons that people were very, very interested in Open RAN a few years ago, and that maybe some of the, I don't know if I'd say, I mean, there's still enthusiasm for it, but maybe it's less of a worry now than it was, is because Nokia was in a terrible state back in 2019 on its 5G strategy. So you were not only facing the prospect of Huawei bans in your market, you were looking at a Nokia that couldn't deliver like competitive systems, and therefore then you have a monopoly. Then you only had Ericsson.
Yeah,
and
which is an issue.
That.
Right.
Whereas they're probably a little bit less worried now that Nokia's sort of got its act together and is all of a sudden looking quite good.
But I don't think anyone doubts that Nokia and Ericsson are properly, healthily competitive with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no little sort of Nordic room they go in and
Well, they have saunas.
cartel.
What, a sauna?
Yeah,
you mean?
exactly.
A sauna.
A sauna, of course. Yeah.
It would be a sauna.
Who invented the sauna? I don't know if it was the Finns or the Swedes, but we sort of associate it with both of them.
Yes. I know. I always, God, we're going on a trip, aren't we, with Nokia? First one in ages.
We are.
I used to hear stories about Nokia trips in the past where they do mental stuff like jumping in ice lakes and then going over.
It's quite like going to their R&D centre in Finland.
And I get worried
it's like a terrible time of the year to go there.
It's very good for you.
That's the thing, though. I was going to say that it has started a global trend. There's lots of this cold therapy going on now everywhere.
There is. Well, Joe Rogan goes on about it
Cryotherapy.
a lot. Yeah.
Do you know what
Try it
cryotherapy is?
Yeah. I get worried that Nokia's going to make me have a sauna with my kit off as well. After I've just been in a cold lake.
I'll let you do it, and then I'll do a later one.
Hopefully there's enough steam that you can see much.
There
I've already got look, the lake was fucking cold, all right? But yeah. So yeah, just circling it back, and then we'll probably wrap up soon unless either of you two have got any other thoughts on anything. Circling back to that story about Germany, and I thought it was an interesting thing. We were talking about that EU toolbox. And my characterisation of the EU toolbox at the time was it felt like a typically quite political EU thing where they let things, rather than putting down hard directives, they give guidelines. But there's something slightly passive-aggressive about the guidelines, like, I think it would be in your interest to do this sort of thing. And we had this, I think we've spoken about it on the pod before, I think Thierry Breton a few months ago came out and went, right, we gave you a chance to do it voluntarily, and now we're going to start being a bit more sort of domineering about it. And that's what I wonder if we've got this incremental stuff going with this Germany situation where it is a bit vague and it's still a bit equivocating and ambiguous, but they're just taking these tiny little incremental steps towards like, right, okay, this is it. We're not fucking around anymore.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the thing I didn't mention earlier was that the interesting thing in the German strategy papers was they're very much linking it to the Russia situation.
In what way?
Right.
So in the way that the two things Germany was very heavily dependent on, or became very heavily dependent on during the Angela Merkel era, were Russian gas and Chinese electronics.
Right, I see.
And then
we know the Russian gas things.
All of a sudden, you're in a situation where you want to impose sanctions on Russia, and the guy who's in charge of Russia goes, right, well, I'm going to turn off the gas taps then. And they've had this huge hassle of trying to sort of, go away from their dependence on Russian gas after having spent a period of time, by the way, switching over every nuclear power plant in Germany.
Yeah.
So it's not like they had a sort of immediate alternative.
Yeah, no, that was cool.
And it was.
Who do we think blew that up here? Where's your theory?
The US.
But it was.
I've heard Norwegians, I've heard Brits, I've heard Russians, I've heard Ukrainians.
It's
like half the world's blown that pipe up, man.
But this
could be either Russia or US.
This was actually made out to be a potential Nord Stream moment for telecom.
Right.
That was how it was made. That I mean, they put it in that way. It was like if the Russians can turn off the gas, the Chinese can turn off the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right.
And
a situation where they invade Taiwan and the Western world kind of decides to get together to support Taiwan.
Yeah, well, that Taiwanese invasion
makes things difficult. If you're trying to impose restrictions on China, then they might decide that they're going to turn off the
I mean, it's critical infrastructure. No matter how you look at it, it's critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
So then it's just deciding what is negotiating versus what is actual malice.
Yeah,
and there is also just the general geopolitical risk side of it. Like I've said many times on the pod, I'm still not fully persuaded by the more hawkish American position that China presents this existential risk. And a few months ago, I wrote a story about Joe Biden declaring a national emergency. Something like a hurricane or something like that. But in this case, the national emergency was that China's getting quite good at technology, which seemed like a sort of spurious, I'm aware of the fact we brought up the geopolitical stuff when my friend Mary, who's also American, was on, and I'm certainly not using an American guest as a proxy for the whole country and the government. Don't think that for 1 second. It just happens to come up. But yeah, I find that a little bit spurious. But then again, I did some research on a story recently and learnt about this. Have you heard this concept of small yard, high fence?
No.
So it's a sort of metaphor for having a small number of things of technologies or intellectual property that the Americans want to protect from like industrial espionage, IP theft or whatever, and then the high fence is just the vigor with which they protect them. And that sort of characterizes how the US government is behaving towards things like chips and IP around chips. And, I don't know, we've certainly spoken on the last two podcasts. I don't know how much you read up on the launch of this Huawei phone that supposedly had a 7-nanometer chip made by SMIC, which they're not supposed to be able to do thanks to this small yard, high fence policy. And so that led to lots of intrigue. And I'm...
Did you see that they're going to charge 5 people with Chinese espionage here?
Is it?
In the UK?
No, I heard about they found some geezer they reckon was a spy. And he's going to be charged. Yeah, I know there's a bit of that going on. But yeah, what I'm in a sort of meandering way leading up to is what I've often called out the US government for, I think, escalating in a way that they haven't done a good enough job of justifying or selling to me. I also know, and I was chatting to people who I won't name at the show this week, they were going, the Chinese have been stealing IP like crazy for decades. So I know it's not groundless.
Right.
It's just I suppose it's just the extent. And it feels now that it's not to do with protecting IP, and it's just to do with trying to keep a major geopolitical competitor down a little bit.
Right.
And that's where I slightly push back. But anyway.
I think it's all of the above.
There we go. Well, it sounds like a good way to end it, isn't it? Has anyone else got anything else to say? No, good. Well, it's great to have you. You reminded me that you were on 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So there we are.
Pandemic.
Every 5 years. We're getting on.
All right.
But it was great to see you again, and thanks a lot for coming. And we're not going to have one next week because someone's doing something else. It's probably your fault, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm in Vegas.
Someone's in Vegas.
Oh yeah, he's actually working. To be fair,
I'm in Rome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like he's just swanning around. And you're in Rome, so we got.
Well, I thought you were going to do one.
Oh, so it's Ian's fault then.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to do one with Pierre not here.
I'm playing golf.
You're at a Ryder Cup.
Yeah.
It was at MWC Vegas. I'm not going to do one by myself. Can you imagine a 2-hour Scott monologue?
Rant.
Yeah. Someone's lucky that didn't happen this time. So you won't get one next week, but make sure you join us for the week after.